The survival of our churches does not depend upon our fundraising techniques. That we have sufficient tools. We can train people on how to run a pledge campaign. There are great books about that. Fundraising is a skill that can be learned. But what we have, the problem that we have in our church funding, I believe, is a failure of theology and a failure of mission. As Unitarian Universalists, we do not have a theology that invites our people into a story more compelling than the cultural story of consumerism. We haven't told them a better story yet, and that is an enormous task for us to do, and I think probably the most compelling task of our time. So the techniques can be learned, but we have to tell them something that is more life-giving and more powerful than the seductive message of consumerism.
I thought I would just tell you a little bit about an experience I had just a week and a half ago. I'm the mother of teenagers. I have a son and a daughter. My son just graduated from high school out in Portland, Oregon. And I don't know how many of you are raising teenagers, boys on the threshold of adulthood? Okay, and how many of you just launched recently, maybe in the last couple of years, launched a teenager or two? Yeah. Congratulations to all of you. My son and I were talking. He's planning to take one of those ubiquitous gap years now, which I think is great when you graduate at 17 and you still don't know how to clean your room. But we were having, he's a lovely, lovely young man, I should say. And we were having a conversation about the world that he's becoming an adult in. And he is very torn between the messages that he gets, and often from me in a span of 5 minutes, about the way things are and the way things might turn out to be. And that made the work that we're doing very present for me. He said, you know, what am I supposed to be preparing for? And I laughed and said, I know, some days I think I shouldn't have prepared you to go to college. I should have apprenticed you to a shoemaker, because that's going to be a really good job, seeing people who can repair shoes. And so these are the questions that our young people are facing in this moment. What is the world going to be like? Am I going to be on my own? Am I going to have to do this all by myself? And where is meaning? Where is meaning in this moment? And I so often, and I'm sure those of you who have raised children or helped or know young people have this moment of thinking, gosh, we really meant to clean the place up before we gave it to you. And we haven't, and they're inheriting some very large problems. And so I hope that our work today helps us prepare their world for stepping into this very large question. What is to become of me? What is the meaning in my life? What's going to happen to us all? And so for the next session, those are some guiding questions for me. If all of us have these concerns, these questions, the sense of pain that we may be feeling around the loss of how things have always been, a sense of fear, what can the church's response be to that pain? Now, someone came up at the break and said to me, are you going to talk about how the church could help with financial planning? And we are going to talk about how the church has direct service to provide to people who are in debt or people facing retirement. People feel very alone in these questions, and we will talk about that. But it's beyond just helping people plan for their own individual responses. We have to help people understand that the way that we have been living is unsustainable individually and as a species. And I think our folks understand that from an ecological point of view, but they may not understand that from an economic point of view, and they may need help understanding it from an emotional and theological point of view. So that's our chief task as a religion, is to help people move from the old story to the new story. Now, I believe, and I said this to my colleagues during ministry days earlier this week, I believe that we don't have a crisis of funding in our churches. We don't have a failure of technique. What we have is a failure of theology. And in fact, I want to say to those of you who are lay people, it is we ministers who have failed you in crafting a theology sufficient for this new era. And I hope that we will, those of you who are colleagues, that we will take that cause up with great haste. Our people live in a story, we all live in a story that is very seductive and very compelling. This is a story about consumerism and all its value and identity that it can give you. And I want to open up that word consumerism a little bit, and I want to read to you this quote from Paul Razor. He's one of our own theologians. He has a wonderful book called Faith Without Certainty. It's a very readable book of theology. I promise there are no footnotes, and everyone should read it. It's just fantastic. And he talks about commodification as one of the core principles of the world in which we live now, the worldview that we have. So let me read you this Paul Razor quote. This is an excerpt from that book. We ordinarily associate consumerism with the felt need to acquire ever-increasing quantities of material goods. But the issue is not simply acquisition. It's not simply getting stuff. It is commodification. Everything now is a commodity to be shopped for. This includes not only ordinary household goods such as cars, housing, furniture, appliances, food, clothing, or services. Today, we also treat as consumer commodities things once considered to be public goods, private relationships, or parts of our inner spiritual identities. Now, we all know how this manifests itself, but I'll just name a few ways. The purchasing of things to create a consumer identity is one thing we know, and I'll just say, folks, if you think that Unitarian Universalists don't participate in using things to create your consumer identities, I would like to tell you how quickly the Priuses are multiplying in my parking lot. This is, in fact, an ecological step, not in my personal parking lot, excuse me, in the church parking lot. Someday I'm going to go out there and they're not going to know, no one's going to know whose car is whose, and they're all going to have to be blinking because I think you use particularly like the light green model. But this is an important ecological choice, but it also is a way of saying, I care about the environment. These are my values. I drive a Prius. And then we put all those bumper stickers on the back, too, right? We're people who wear certain kinds of clothes, and that's how we identify ourselves to one another. We're people who, who live in certain kinds of houses. They're not too fancy, but they're nice. When we have our kitchens remodeled, those of us who own homes, we do it tastefully, but we still have people over to see it, don't we? We also, though we don't have a lot of flashy jewelry, we do like to take vacations in really interesting but educational places and tell our friends about our trips. That's identity construction using goods and services. But now we have, it has found its way into the more, what used to be the more private spheres. And we can see in this even how people interact with their families and with their churches. People leave marriages because they weren't getting their needs met. Now, it's important to have your needs met, but there's also something larger going on when we experience relationships primarily as what it's doing for me. And this plays out in our churches in very tragic ways as well. It means that people arrive with a consumerist shopper mindset, and all of the church language, and many even of the Alban Institute, very fine institute, the Alban Institute, but many of their books come from that. How can you meet people where they are? What do visitors want? What do they need? Should you have coffee? Like, I keep waiting to go into a church and see a Starbucks kiosk right in the church. We are wanting to meet people, with what they need, but it's actually what they desire. And this plays out with people expecting to be served, with the minister often seen as the wait person for people's spiritual desires, as opposed to a leader in a religiously covenanted community. People are focused upon themselves then, rather than anticipating that they're entering a covenanted community that is mission focused. And I'm sure you all could articulate many ways that you have seen this happen in our churches. It also, this commodification and church shopping also creates class barriers. And what happens then is that we worship with people like ourselves, and church shopping allows us to become spiritually gated communities where we cluster with others in what are essentially lifestyle enclaves. Now, this is bad, as my kids would say. This is bad, Mom, but why? We are the ones who lose out in this. It's not that we need to be there to save other people, although that's true. We lose out because we isolate ourselves into our own cultural narrative, our own class cultural narrative in particular, and we lose the gifts of a broader community. And this is not the beloved community to which so many of us say we aspire. The beloved community crosses and breaks down all barriers that divide. And if we are in a spiritual lifestyle enclave, a spiritual gated community, then we are not the beloved community. So what would a different story tell us about community? What would a different vision be of a multicultural, multi-class, mission-focused congregation that is countering the message of commodification, that is laying bare the narrative of old, the story in which we all live, and is proclaiming and crafting together a new story to which we can commit our lives? What would that vision look like? We don't actually really know what that looks like yet. We're just starting to kind of imagine the possibilities of what that vision might actually be. We are in a transformational moment. As I told my son, I cannot imagine a better time to be alive than right now, poised at the brink of this transformation. Cannot imagine better work to be doing with all of you than this transformational moment.
Have any of you here had a congregant whom you learned was out of work for a long time before you ever heard that they had lost their job? Yeah. We ministers are really having that phenomena a lot. People ashamed to come forward and tell us that? What about the theology and spirituality that says, if you don't have an increasing income, it's probably not a good idea for you to talk about it in our church? How did we inadvertently create within our church the norms in which a person would be ashamed to come forward and say they are losing their house? They have lost their job. Their circumstances are so adversely affected that they now have no sight of retirement in the future. How did that get to happen? It happens when we choose theologies that are all about valuing income and independence and self-sufficiency. And those are some of the theologies that say you have to earn your way righteously into eternal life. Our universalist tradition has taught us otherwise. It has taught us to bend justice down to touch the earth, to create in this earth the environment in which everyone can discuss these truths of their lives freely. On a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is the best, perfect candor about what's going on in our economic lives, and 1 where these words shall never be spoken, what number is your congregation?